Have you ever wondered what it means to be born into a palace only to become a prisoner of its golden walls? Imagine a child dressed in silks and pearls, admired by courtiers, yet destined for a fate that was decided long before her first cry was heard. Margarita Teresa of Spain, remembered in Velázquez's Las Meninas, was no fairy tale princess. Her life was not one of freedom or joy, but of chains carefully forged by bloodlines, rituals, and the unyielding ambition of a dynasty. Behind the splendor of the Habsburg court, a darker truth was hidden. This little girl's body and soul were never her own. Subscribe now, because what you are about to uncover is not simply history, it is the story of a sacrifice made in the name of power. The royal court of Madrid glittered with chandeliers, polished marble, and the scent of incense rising from endless chapels. Yet for Margarita, it was less a home and more a cage. Her daily life was scripted, her gestures rehearsed, her words measured. To the outside world, she was the innocent child princess, a symbol of Spain's grandeur. But inside the palace walls, she lived under the constant watch of Doña Elvira, a stern matron appointed to monitor her every move. Doña Elvira's shadow fell over every corner of Margarita's life, deciding when she could play, what she could eat, how she should sit, and even how she should smile. Every corridor she walked echoed with footsteps that were not her own. Every glance from the courtiers carried the weight of expectation. The palace whispered secrets she was too young to understand, yet she could feel them pressing against her like invisible hands. Was she a beloved daughter of the kingdom, or merely a fragile vessel for its survival? Even in moments of laughter, her giggles were quickly silenced, as if joy itself was forbidden. The grand tapestries on the walls seemed to watch her, recording each movement like silent witnesses to a fate already sealed. In this golden prison, a haunting question lingered. If every breath is dictated, every choice stolen, can one truly call it life? For Margarita Teresa, childhood was not a chapter of wonder, but the beginning of a slow descent into a destiny she never chose. Every moment of Margarita's day became an entry in a leather-bound ledger. The physicians arrived before dawn, murmuring in a language of pulses and humors, weighing her like a parcel, measuring her breath as if it could be taxed. Doña Elvira stood by with a quill, recording the angle of the princess's posture, the color in her cheeks, the hours she slept. A laugh, if it escaped, was captured and punished with silence. Composure, Elvira would say, pressing a cool palm to the child's temple as though joy were a fever to be brought down. Even toys were vetted, carved animals with blunted edges, dolls whose eyes would not close. The windows were narrow, the light obedient. Outside, bells rang for mass. Inside, the air smelled of vinegar, lavender, and ink. In the schoolroom, a map of Europe hung like a net waiting to drop. Priests trained her tongue to form perfect prayers. Tutors drilled etiquette until curtsies felt like kneeling. When she reached for a question, "Why must I be so careful?" the room itself seemed to tighten. Answers came in parables about duty and providence. "A princess belongs to more than herself," said the confessor gently, as if mercy could sweeten the chain. At night, when the palace finally exhaled, she pressed her ear to the cold stone and listened. The building had a heartbeat, old, patient, and unhurried. It reminded her that time, like stone, was on the side of those who waited. Word of a match arrived without drama, as if the future had merely stepped out from behind a curtain. The name Leopold was delivered in a letter sealed with black wax, its script crisp as winter. He was a sovereign, a scholar of music, a man of piety. He was also her elder by many years, and her kin besides. Courtiers spoke of this as a blessing, the neat tying of two branches of a mighty tree. Yet Margarita felt the tree was hollow, its roots drinking from a dry well. "Is a promise still a promise if it was made before I could speak?" she asked Doña Elvira. The matron lowered her eyes. "Some vows are older than voices. The preparations moved like clockwork, a proxy wedding arranged in Madrid, the fabric for her gown counted and weighed, the ring measured for a finger still soft from childhood. Musicians practiced a march that sounded less like celebration and more like a corridor with no doors. At Vespers, the chapel candles trembled. Somewhere, a draught slid under the altar rail and kissed her ankles. She did not weep. Instead, she watched the flame of a single candle tilt and right itself, stubborn against the pull of air. "Will I be like that?" she wondered, "or will I go out quietly?" When the day came, she stood beneath a crown that had pressed upon many heads before hers, and the air filled with incense thick enough to taste. The contract was recited, the witnesses nodded, the ledger closed. Outside, the sky turned the color of old silver. Inside, a girl took a step toward destiny, and the palace, sated for the moment, fell still. The proxy vows in Madrid had been spoken, but the true journey began with departure. Margarita Teresa left behind the echoing halls of her childhood and stepped into the long road toward Vienna, where the husband she had never touched would wait. The journey itself was an ordeal, carriages jolting over stones, priests chanting for protection at every border, couriers carrying news of her progress as though she were cargo. Crowds gathered to watch the pale girl pass, whispering blessings or suspicions. Her attendants reported that she slept uneasily, often waking with tears she refused to explain. Was it fear of the unknown, or the dread certainty that she was not traveling toward freedom, but deeper into confinement? Vienna welcomed her not as a bride, but as an answer to a political equation. The city's towers and spires glittered in the winter sun, yet beneath their shine lay coldness. The palace corridors seemed longer, the ceilings higher, the air itself thinner, as though designed to remind her of how small she truly was. Even the walls bore witness. Portraits of past empresses gazed down with unreadable eyes, their jewels gleaming like chains. Court officials bowed with precise gestures, but their eyes slid over her, as if already measuring her capacity for survival. Vienna was not home. It was a labyrinth whose doors locked from the outside. Leopold, her new husband and also her bloodkin, greeted her with courtesy and formality. His words were gentle, yet there was an absence of warmth, as if affection had no place in a marriage carved from treaties. He spoke of duty, of the great task they shared, of the expectation that together they would preserve a dynasty. Margarita listened with lowered lashes, wondering whether her silence would ever be mistaken for consent. Nights in Vienna were colder than Madrid's, and in the silence she often heard the faint tolling of bells, each chime sounding like a warning. The palace doctors resumed their rituals, their hands cool and clinical, speaking in hushed Latin as though the girl before them were no more than a specimen. Her meals were prescribed with care, her hours charted against the stars. She was 16 by then, but her life was less her own than ever. Each day reinforced the truth. This was no marriage of hearts, but of empires. And so, Margarita Teresa learned to move quietly through corridors, her footsteps swallowed by stone, her face a mask of serenity. Behind that mask, however, questions festered. Would the walls of this palace be the last she ever saw? Was she a wife, or merely an heirloom passed from one branch of a fading tree to another? The physicians of Vienna were relentless. To them, Margarita Teresa was not a young woman of flesh and feeling, but an object of study, a fragile vessel meant to bear the future of two empires. Their chambers smelled of herbs, candle smoke, and iron. They pressed fingers against her pulse, weighed her with the solemnity of judges, and prescribed remedies that often bordered on torment. There were bitter potions of wormwood and saffron, poultices wrapped tight around her stomach, and long hours confined to bed under the belief that stillness might anchor life in her womb. When she winced, they called it weakness. When she wept, they named it hysteria. No one asked what she wanted, for her body was not hers. It was a battlefield for dynasties. At night, she felt the sting of needles, the heat of poultices, and the chill of whispered prayers. The corridors outside her chamber grew darker, longer, and lonelier. Even the servants walked on softened feet, avoiding her gaze as though afraid to see their own reflection in her suffering. Margarita's youth was slipping away under the weight of rituals disguised as medicine. Each sunrise promised not hope but another test, another trial, another round of examinations that treated her less like a bride and more like an experiment. Then came the first cries of grief. In 1667, her womb betrayed her, or so the physicians claimed. The pregnancy ended in silence, the cradle prepared for a child that never drew breath. The court's mourning was brief, perfunctory, and politically inconvenient. Before the linens were folded away, she was already being told to try again. The following year brought no reprieve. Another loss, this time so late that the palace shook with despair. Priests recited litanies, midwives whispered old superstitions, and doctors argued over treatments as though her body were a failing instrument to be tuned. And through it all, Margarita lay in bed with her hands over her hollowed belly, wondering how much more of herself she could lose before nothing remained. The palace itself seemed to echo her sorrow. In the great hallways, her footsteps grew faint. Tapestries of triumph and conquest hung heavy on the walls, their bright colors mocking her empty arms. At night, she dreamed of children's laughter, but awoke to the suffocating silence of stone. Each miscarriage carved away at her spirit, leaving her not only weaker but more haunted. It was as though the palace had become a mausoleum for lives that never were, and she the unwilling guardian of its ghosts. With each passing year, Margarita Teresa's body bore the marks of relentless struggle. The spark of vitality that once lit her eyes was dimmed, replaced by the pallor of exhaustion. Her frame, once delicate with youth, grew frailer under the weight of repeated pregnancies and the invasive rituals that accompanied them, yet the court seemed blind to her decline. To them, she was no longer a woman but a mechanism, a sacred machine expected to deliver heirs no matter the toll. Ministers spoke of her future children as though they were already ink on parchment, not fragile lives still locked in uncertainty. Every smile she forced, every curtsy she performed, was a mask to cover a truth few dared acknowledge. She was breaking. In 1670, a flicker of light pierced the darkness. Against the odds, she gave birth to a living child, a daughter, Maria Antonia. The infant's cries rang through the halls like a fragile hymn, and for a brief moment, Margarita allowed herself to believe she had triumphed. She held the child against her breast, inhaling the scent of new life, whispering prayers of gratitude. Yet even in this moment of joy, shadows gathered. The court's congratulations were tinged with disappointment, their smiles brittle. A girl, they murmured behind closed doors. A beginning, but not enough. For the dynasty, only a male heir could secure the fragile threads of empire. The joy of a mother's embrace was already being smothered by the cold arithmetic of succession. The whispers reached her ears no matter how she tried to ignore them. Servants exchanged glances. Officials lowered their voices when she entered the room. Maria Antonia was a treasure to her mother, yet to others she was an inadequate answer to a question of power. Margarita often lingered by the child's cradle, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest, wondering if love alone could shield her from the same cruel fate. Will she grow to be free? Margarita asked herself. Or will she too be traded like a coin between crowns? The palace corridors, once suffocating, now seemed filled with phantom laughter, as though the unborn children she had lost were still wandering its echoing chambers. And now, with a living daughter, the contrast became unbearable. Life on one side, disappointment on the other. Each night, Margarita pressed her lips to her child's forehead, silently vowing to protect her, though she knew such vows held little power in a world ruled by treaties and bloodlines. The joy of Maria Antonia's birth faded swiftly beneath the weight of expectation. Margarita Teresa's body had not yet recovered when whispers of another pregnancy began to circulate. Advisors pressed their hands together in solemn gestures, urging Leopold to remind his young wife of her duty. Physicians reappeared with their endless regimens, bleeding to balance her humors, herbs to strengthen the womb, long periods of forced stillness that drained her spirit more than they preserved her health. Even as her hands trembled from weakness, she was reminded that the empire's survival depended upon her fertility. The walls of the palace seemed to lean closer, listening, demanding, never granting her space to breathe. What little companionship she might have found in Vienna was devoured by loneliness. Courtiers avoided her chamber, uncomfortable in the presence of her sorrow. Her attendants, bound by duty, obeyed but never confided. In the stillness of night, Margarita often whispered her thoughts to the empty air, asking questions that no one would answer. Am I a wife or a vessel, a queen or a prisoner, a woman or merely a shadow? Silence was her only reply. Her pregnancies became harder, each one a gauntlet of pain and fear. Blood stained the silken sheets too often, leaving physicians murmuring and priests scrambling for prayers. The shadow of Spain's succession crisis loomed over every chamber, intensifying the pressure. Her half-brother, Charles II, was frail, plagued by the same legacy of inbreeding, and unlikely to leave heirs. This meant the burden of two great thrones, the Spanish and the Austrian, seemed to rest upon her fragile frame. With every faltering step she took, the courtiers' anxiety grew sharper, their expectations heavier. By 1673, Margarita's strength was nearly spent. When her body betrayed her once more, labor came early and violently. The chamber filled with the bitter scent of herbs, the murmurs of physicians, the sharp cries of midwives urging her to endure. But this time, endurance was beyond her reach. She was only 21, yet her face bore the fatigue of decades. Her voice, once timid but steady, dwindled into faint gasps. The infant did not survive, and soon neither did she. The last candle by her bedside flickered low, as if reluctant to witness the end. When the silence finally fell, it was absolute. The bells of Vienna tolled their hollow notes, announcing the loss of a princess who had never truly lived for herself. But the palace moved swiftly. Ministers convened within hours, their voices cold, their discussions already turning toward Leopold's next marriage. Her death was not a tragedy to them, it was an inconvenience, quickly filed away beneath new contracts and alliances. The silence left by Margarita Teresa's death was swiftly drowned by the noise of politics. Even as her body lay in state, courtiers whispered in corners, their minds already fixed on succession and treaties. To them, her life had been a transaction, her death was merely a failed investment. Leopold, draped in mourning black, listened as advisors presented lists of suitable brides, each name accompanied by calculations of dowries and alliances. It was as though Margarita's short life had vanished in the ink of new contracts. No lamentation, no pause, only the relentless grind of empire, moving forward over the ashes of her youth. But history does not erase so easily. Her absence carved fractures into the dynasty she was meant to strengthen. Spain's throne was left perilously exposed, its last hope tied to the frail body of Charles II, her half-brother. Austria, too, faced uncertainty, its emperor still without the sons he desperately needed. The political gamble of marrying a young niece to her uncle had not preserved the Habsburg line, it had only hastened its collapse. Within decades, the cracks widened into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would drag Europe into chaos. In this way, Margarita Teresa's suffering was not a private tragedy, but a harbinger of continental upheaval. Yet beyond politics, a different legacy endures. In Velázquez's Las Meninas, the little girl stands at the center of the canvas, framed by light, her wide eyes looking out as though pleading across centuries. Viewers marvel at her beauty, her poise, her innocence, captured for eternity. Few realize that those eyes belong to a child already condemned by decisions made long before she was born. Behind the brushstrokes lies the silent scream of a girl imprisoned in silk, and perhaps that is why her story continues to unsettle. She was not slain on a battlefield, nor assassinated by an enemy's blade. Her life was consumed by rituals of duty, by the suffocating weight of bloodlines, by the merciless indifference of power. Her fate reminds us that palaces can be prisons, that crowns can cut as sharply as chains, and that history often hides its cruelties behind the veil of grandeur. So, when you gaze upon Las Meninas, ask yourself, are you looking at a princess or a prisoner, a daughter of empire or a victim of its ambition? Margarita Teresa's eyes seem to hold the answer, an answer both haunting and timeless, echoing from the shadows of a dynasty that devoured its own children.